Good afternoon, everyone. Very nice to be here with you. There's no chairperson, so I'm going to introduce myself. Who are you? I'm Terry Cannon. So very pleased to meet you all. Many of you have met me already. If not, I'm here in the Rural Futures Cluster, and my particular specialism is rural livelihoods, climate change adaptation, and natural hazards and disaster vulnerability in natural hazards. And today what I want to focus on is something which has been coming up more and more in my concerns in the last 5 to 10 years, really. And it's really a concern about how language and terminology is used in development studies. And we're all aware of jargon. We're all aware of how words become buzzwords, but I'm actually asking a more deeper question than something about buzzwords. I'm asking about how concepts and terminology is used actually to disguise or divert us away from understanding a problem. And there are other terms that I'm concerned about, but I'm going to focus today on the word community because it comes up a great deal in the work I do, mostly through what is called community-based adaptation for climate change and community-based disaster risk reduction. But as you will know, it is widely used in all areas of development, as you will see later. So the key arguments that I want to make, and I'm going to hope to provide some evidence to convince you, and I don't imagine that I will convince everyone today. We might want to discuss what it is that is resistance to accepting what I'm saying, because I think that's actually quite interesting. Why is it difficult to accept what I'm saying? And I find it especially difficult to persuade staff in NGOs to accept these arguments. So it'll be very interesting to see. How many have got to leave at 2 o'clock for a class or something? Okay, well, I'll aim to finish at 1:45, so at least you get some time for questions, because I imagine there will be quite a lot to discuss. So the term community has become the default terminology in many organizations, when really what we're doing is talking about people, places, locations. So what I'm concerned about is how has it slid over into using the term community when in almost every situation you can substitute the word people or place, and that would be perfectly acceptable. And why I think that's a problem to use the word community instead of people or location is because it has embedded within it some moral attributes which are dangerous. So that is what I want to argue and to say. And I think that the word community is perceived and framed for our benefit. And by our, I mean generally those who are engaged in the development business, ranging from us as researchers through NGOs, through to international organizations, World Bank, donors especially, which we'll come back to shortly. And the argument I'm making is that its use is new. I'm going to try to demonstrate to you with a little bit of evidence, which I'm hoping to increase with one of our students, Dion, over here, is going to be working with me to provide more empirical evidence for how the terminology has evolved and emerged really in the last 20 years as a new terminology. And I'll show you why I think it's new with some examples. And key to it is that the word community, in my view, provides a moral claim. It has embedded within it a moral claim which is akin to concepts in social science and psychology, which I'm investigating to see how much these can be helpful in understanding it. And these two concepts are used usually about individuals and not about development terminology. So one of them is called virtue signaling. And virtue signaling is the behavior, usually of individuals, where they do an act which makes them look good to everybody else. So it's like donating money to a charity, but you don't keep it secret. You know, you wear it as a badge, which demonstrates your virtue to others. My argument is that the term community, because it has this morality embedded in it, is also a form of virtue signaling. And the other related one, slightly related, is called the halo effect. And the halo effect is used in psychology to, if I just quote, if the observer likes one aspect of something, i.e. we use the word community, they will have a positive predisposition towards everything about it. So if we use the term community, it's a badge of approval, of affirmation for everything that goes on under the label of community. So this is, I think, what we need to actually understand, the virtue signaling that goes on and the halo effect that is embedded within it. And the main problem that I want to put across in using the term community is that in most parts of the world, not everywhere, but in most parts of the world, what we are trying to do is to deal with poverty, in my case with disasters, and climate change with people's vulnerability to hazards and climate change. Okay, so we in development studies or development action are trying to do things about poverty and vulnerability. Okay, and my problem is that the concept of community enables us to escape from explaining what causes poverty and vulnerability. And this is part of the ideology of what's going on at the moment, is that terminology is used in order to avoid actually explaining the problems that we're looking at. So in most of the world, probably 80% of the world's population who are rural have a problem of access to land. So land tenure in almost all of Asia, in much of Southeast Asia, in much of Latin America, and in some parts of Africa is highly unequally owned. And this is the embedded power relationships of the class systems that operate in those societies. Now, we hardly ever talk about class anymore. And when I try to talk about land tenure in classes, most students here and at other universities where I teach have not got a clue what that means. What does land tenure mean? Well, land tenure for the vast majority of the rural population of the world means that in most communities, one or two families own most of the land, a few families own some of the land, and the vast majority of people own tiny bits of land or no land at all. They are landless. Okay? And we are expecting them to deal with disasters, with climate change and so on, when a fundamental asset, a resource, is not available to them. So my concern about this term is that it evades explaining why they are poor and why they are vulnerable. Okay? It is not deliberate, it's not a conspiracy. We've slipped into it using this term because it is virtue signaling, it has a halo effect to make it look like we're concerned, because the word community conveys the idea of collaboration, of communalism, of being able to cooperate at the local level to achieve whatever it is that the outsiders are coming to try to do. The agent of development is trying to improve their lives, development. And what this is avoiding and evading is actually understanding what is causing their poverty and their vulnerability. Because a high proportion of the poverty and the vulnerability that is going on in the community is caused by processes of power going on in that place. In other words, the poor and the vulnerable are made poor and vulnerable by power systems that are going on in that place. So how can we talk about it being a community without understanding that the problem we are trying to address through development is actually being caused within that place? So to give you two rather simplistic, crude examples, personal examples, many years ago when I did my first rural livelihoods research, I was visiting Tamil Nadu in South India. And I had a very good Tamil friend who spoke excellent English. And he was actually an English teacher. And he said, "Oh, come on, we go for a day out. I want you to see my home village," which was on the coast. And we went there on the bus, got out and had a lovely day. We ate fresh coconuts, I swam in the ocean, and met some of his colleagues and friends. And we were about to leave, and he said, "Oh no, the head of the village has seen us. I'll now have to introduce you to him because otherwise it'll look like it's very rude. I'll get in trouble." Now, I already knew that my friend was from the Christian part of this community, and the majority were Hindu. Okay? So the head of the village comes over to greet me. He doesn't speak any English. My friend's translating. He says, come and see my house, see my temple, blah, blah, blah. And then we're going back to the town, getting on the bus, and I'm shaking hands with the head of the village to say my goodbyes. And my friend is saying in my ear, oh, by the way, the reason he's the head of the village is he owns most of the land. And last year, the people who work on his land, because he doesn't work, he keeps his hands clean, the people who work on his land protested about his low wages, and the two leaders were killed. So I carry on smiling, shaking hands, get out of there as quickly as I can. It's the only known murderer that I've shaken hands with. But this man was free. Nothing had ever happened to him. Everyone in the village knew he'd killed these two people, not with his hands. He obviously got somebody else to do it. And this is the situation in rural power structures all over the world. It would be happening in other countries. It still happens in India. It happens in Bangladesh. If somebody makes a fuss about the way in which they're being treated by their superior classes, they're at risk of being oppressed or, at worst, being killed. Okay? And this is a key factor. So I told this... Sorry, the other thing is, if you went to this village to do a project, Oxfam or World Food Programme or somebody, who's the person you would talk to enable you to do the project in that location? It would be this man. In other words, the entire project is tainted from the start because the project itself and the outsiders become embedded in the power systems which are going on in that place. Now, I told this story to a friend of mine who was head of disasters and climate change at two very large international NGOs. And he said, oh, that's nothing. I was working on a project in Sudan in the 80s. It was a water harvesting project, and we had to do some earth moving to capture water and so on. And I was young, naive, and I said to the head of the village, another head of the village, the chief, whatever, I said, this is supposed to be a community-based project. And every day the same people turn up to do the work, to do the shifting, to do whatever. But it's supposed to be participatory, and everyone's supposed to be involved in order to own the project, And he said, oh, don't worry about that. They're our slaves. So this was a normal practice for them, that they could employ a section of the community to do the hard work. They didn't have to do it. So I'm not arguing that everywhere in the world there are not things which we could call communities and have some validity. It seems to me that the two most prominent exclusions from my concern are indigenous peoples, who in most parts of the world form communities in the sense that this is for thriving and surviving. They are engaged in collaborative behavior, which is part of their culture and their tradition. And the other, it could be argued, is pastoralists. In many parts of the world, pastoralists collaborate very well. They move together. They operate on the basis of, if you like, a community structure. And these are potential exclusions from it. Now, the reason they are potential exclusions is within their economy, there is not an exploitative situation going on. There is not an owner of the resources who is exploiting others for the benefit of that gain. As you find in most of the world, in rural societies, you have unequal land tenure. Some people call it feudal or semi-feudal systems of land ownership. And those are the systems which cause poverty and vulnerability in those places. So the term community is used by us to kind of create a situation in which we can feel comfortable because we're imagining, we have an imagination that sees the people here as potentially collaborative and working together to join with us in our cause. Now, all of those points are on that slide. If anyone wants the slides, I can email them to you, so just give me your email address, because there isn't a list, obviously, for this seminar, so please share your email with me. So a little bit of evidence of how the word is coming in. So It's a bit sad because it's going to look like I'm biased against IIED. I've worked with IIED, I still work with IIED, collaborate with them. So it's a bit unfair that theirs are coming up, because you could choose any organization, any NGO, you'd find the similar thing. And that's what we're doing, is to find this data. So here, vulnerable communities, this is the word that is used, is to highlight it as if it's one entity. And this is where the problem arises. If you talk about it as a community or a vulnerable community, you're assuming everyone in it is the same. It's an entity, homogeneous. And that's the wrong thing, because every single so-called community on this earth is divided not only in class terms, in these rural land systems, but on gender terms. Half of the world's population is oppressed in the community by the other half of the world's population. If we really take gender issues seriously, we cannot use the concept community, because the concept implies that there is a collectivity within that place which is willing and able to act together to achieve whatever it is we're doing from outside. And if somebody says, oh yes, but we empower women, our project is to target women and we empower women. So you have a 3-year project, max 5-year project, okay? Who can tell me with a degree of certainty that after your 3-year project, you have changed patriarchy, you've changed male-female relations, such that in Bangladesh, for example, after your project, a 50-year-old man has stopped thinking that it's legitimate to marry a 15-year-old girl? It's not going to happen. Your 3-year project is trying to shift hundreds of years of cultural beliefs and behaviors. So how can we do that? And nobody ever goes back. You appraise, you evaluate the project. Nobody ever goes back after 10 years or 15 years to see if it worked. Is that true? Anyone who's been involved in projects? Has anyone ever gone back after 10 years to see if it worked? No, it doesn't happen. Okay, so here's another example. Climate adaptation funds to support community priorities. Well, in any community, there are different priorities. In any participatory research that you do, one of the first things you find is that males and females have very different priorities. It's a very common finding. Children have different priorities. The landlord, the guy I shook hands with, will have a different priority from the farmers, the people who actually do the work. So I'm going to just blow up this paragraph here, because this really illustrates, to my mind, the problem that we've got. So it's assuming that the agent of change is the community and that the outside organization facilitates that change. And it's a unified body of people to which you bring something which is going to improve their lives, in this case, adaptation to climate change. And, sorry, wrong button. Later on the next page, it says, one way to achieve this is to establish mechanisms allowing local communities to participate in the planning and development related funding through their elected representatives at local government level. That's what should be going on already. Why is that not? So the thing we need to ask is, why are these things not going on already? So what are the systems of power that are operating there that make these things wrong in this way? This one I found extraordinary. Forced Migration Review, which I think is an excellent journal, doing really important work. And then they issued a call for papers in 2016. I know you can't see it, but it says, local communities, first and last providers of protection. Have they heard of Yugoslavia or Rwanda or Syria or Iraq? You know, this is just making claims for things which cannot happen. The community in many parts of the world is where conflict is embedded within the community, like my landlord who killed the 2 workers. It's going on within them. So you can read this. I haven't got time to go through this, but that's there. If you get the slides, you can get a bit of background as to how it's romanticized and really trying to do things which are impossible in most circumstances because it's in the community that you find conflict. Sri Lanka, Myanmar, where we're watching it right now, this is nonsense. And it's trying to impose an idea of community because it's fluffy, it's cuddly, it makes it look good. Let's do that. Okay, so more examples. This is on how fast is the Nile Delta sinking. The Nile Delta is 41% of the population of the country. These communities, why use the word community? What you mean is people. Okay, the Nile Delta and Egyptian land generally is amongst the most unequal in ownership in Africa. Okay, the ordinary working labourers who work on the land of those who own the land are the ones who are vulnerable. So the use of the term community here is conveying a sense that there is a collective at the local level which doesn't exist. So what is going on in all this? And then we have community. You just put community-based in front of any problem and it's immediately solved. So community-based anything, saint community cures all ills. Okay, so all you have to do is put that in front and everything is fine. So this is a tool in Google called Google Ngram. So this is the plot for the phrase community-based, and you can see how it's really just jumped up in recent decades. It wasn't there before. So I then thought, well, let's look back. Where has it come from? Why are we using it suddenly? Some IDS working papers. So I looked at some that are about 20 years old. And this one is, the point about this is these two working papers, I didn't have time to go into a lot of searching them and doing word counts and so on, but I just chose two from 20 years ago that these days would be full of the word community. That's the word they would use. The default word would be community. But in these two working papers, the word isn't used. So why is it changed? So in this one, the word community is used once and then twice in the references. People is the word that is used, meaning local people. So why is it not good enough just to talk about people? And this one's the same. Community used twice, people around 50 times in the sense of meaning the people at the local level. Very interesting paper, which I hadn't seen before, which I'm not going to have time to go into. So what is a community? What does it involve? Who uses the term? Practically everyone nowadays. Does everyone belong to one? Are they divided? What is the divisions within them? And it's implied that they are something in common. There's a common way of life, a sense of belonging. These are traditional kind of sociology definitions of what it means to be in a community. Do the people use these terms? No. It's very rare that people themselves use a word which we could translate as community about themselves. It doesn't happen. The word community is translated by us. It's a word that we use, which we take to developing countries and say, you're a community. We're going to work with you to improve your lives on water, sanitation, health, disaster risk reduction, whatever. And the people themselves would not use the term community about themselves. They wouldn't even necessarily have a word that translates that way. So we use it for our convenience. And I'm wondering if there's something wrong with this. Well, I gave you a bit of a clue at the start when I called it a myth. So then there's the issue as whether communities can be created by interventions. So, and the argument here is, can you change the incentives that people have for their behavior on a particular issue? So this is, if you like, the argument for outside agencies providing a catalytic role. A catalyst is a tiny, tiny amount of a substance which makes a big change when you put it into a chemical reaction. Okay, so it's a tiny fraction, like our money from development and so on, is a tiny fraction of the money sloshing around the world, most of it making problems worse, not better. And we're trying to be catalysts to go into a place and say, right, we've come to empower women, or we've come to empower the vulnerable to cyclones, and we're going to do this. Can you do that? So the issue is, to what extent can an outside organization bring with them incentives that change people's behavior, which has been going on for hundreds of years. Can we do that in 3 years, 5 years max? And if it's community-based, why are the people not doing it themselves already? If it's so good, why aren't they doing it? Okay? And what goes on after the NGO or whatever the agency of change leaves? Does it have longevity? Does it have durability? And what are the conditions in which it can be self-sustained, durability, and so on? Now, two economists at the World Bank, very interesting people who have been working on this problem for many years. It's not the next slide, I think it's the one after. I'll show you their work. But basically their work, Mansouri and Rao, is part of a lot of work that's being ignored. There's a huge amount of research which, if we built it into our understanding of what's going on in the world, would fundamentally undermine the use of the term community. So the first is critiques of the concept community itself, which go back at least to the 1950s in American sociology. So the idea that you have community structures or systems, whatever, then concerns over the notion of participation, whether it works or not, and for whom does it work. And I'll give you a couple of examples. Very conscious of Robert being in the room, but that's all right. He and I have talked about this quite a lot over the last couple of years. Then there is the issue of elite capture. Is that a concept you've all heard of? Yes? I mean, why are we not discussing community in the concept of elite capture? Because it's a major, major problem in anything that is done in relation to development, disaster risk reduction, climate change adaptation. And the research on land tenure, which goes back decades, IDS being amongst the first to highlight it as a constraint on development, including problems of landlessness, millions in India and South Asia in debt bondage, the problem of landlords in link with political parties, basically running the countries for their own benefits. This is the typical story in most of Asia. Okay? All over the countries where there is unequal land tenure, there is an unhealthy alliance between those who are the landed people, the rich people with land, and the political parties that run the country. That's how they operate. So how, with our 3-year project, are we going to shift those power relationships? So this literature, when I started my work on India many, many years ago, the first thing I had to do when I was going to do my work in India, which was in Haryana and West Bengal, was to understand the land tenure system. If you don't understand where you are working, what is the system of ownership and the class system that is related to that, you will understand nothing at all about what's going on in front of your eyes. Okay? And yet in the last 10 years, I've been working in Bangladesh. I've been to the coast, which, as you know, is facing sea level rise, cyclones and so on, probably 5 times, working with NGOs, local NGOs and international NGOs. And we've been there to look at how can you do things for disaster risk reduction and climate adaptation. Never once in any of those visits where we're around villages going to see people, never once has anyone mentioned landlessness as a major problem of people being able to deal with disaster risk or climate adaptation, or development for that matter. And in that area, between 40 and 60% of the rural population are landless. They have no control, basically no control over their own lives. They're the ones who go to the owner of the land and get $1 a day, if they're lucky, to work on that landlord's land. And it's not usually enough to last them through the year. Okay? So why is this being ignored? It is the most fundamental thing, is to understand the power relationships of gender and class which are going on in the locations where we claim to be doing development or disaster work or climate change adaptation. So class is being ignored, India, caste is being ignored as the causation of poverty and vulnerability. Now, if you look at any of these at all, it completely undermines the notions of adaptation and resilience and community. The word community does not come out of this at all, meaning it is not a meaningful concept once you've done this work. Now, Mansouri and Rao produced this book a few years ago, and if there's a bit of, how am I for time? Not very good for time. What I suggest, because I'm running out of time, is that you all look at this video of it. This is a free download book, by the way. The point of this book is that they analysed 500 projects which had received World Bank funding for localised development. Localised development meaning at the community level in a participatory way. They found that in the vast majority of them there had been elite capture. This talk he gives here is 30 minutes of the best you would ever spend in development studies. This is two people from the World Bank who were threatened to be censored by the World Bank because this is explosive stuff. The World Bank has spent $80 billion on this stuff, and basically they're showing that it was mostly rubbish. Okay? So they faced an awful lot of pressure in the bank, and they're telling it like it is. They've been working on this for more than 10 years, trying to get people to understand this. Now, their work is not directly looking at the concept of community. It's looking at the way in which participation is used or not in localized development. And one of the key things that they distinguish is between what they call, well, it's not the word they use for it, spontaneous activities. They're organic. They call it organic movements. They say, well, the anti-apartheid movement, the Arab Spring and all, these were people self-organizing against a cause, okay? They said when an agency goes to a place to do development or disaster risk, whatever, they are the outside agent. Remember, are they the catalyst? Can they change people's behavior? Can they change the class system? Can they change patriarchy during the 3-year project? No, they can't. So what can they do? And they call this induced participation. They say the external agency induces people in that locality to take part in their project activities. And basically they say that this is always subverted by the power systems that exist in that place, which leads to the elite capture of the resources that are given in that place. So I do urge you to have a look at this. On participation, there are a number of recent academic studies which are quite interesting. This one, some friends of mine did in Bangladesh. Basically, they did some participatory methods in villages about cyclone risk, and they realized that the people who were coming to the focus group discussions were all henchmen of the landlord. So the focus group discussion, which was supposed to discuss local problems of dealing with cyclones, had been packed out by the local most powerful guy. And they found this, and it's quite interesting. David, one of the authors, said, Terry, we only realized this after your talk in Bangladesh 2 years before, when you critiqued the concept of community. And something went off in their mind to think about how do we understand what it is we're seeing with these people. So there's always, their highlights, always a vested interest in resource distribution, marginality, blah, blah, blah. You can see all that, okay. Then Bina Agarwal, a very, very famous Indian economist, did this on gender, the falseness of participation in relation to gender. And this one, the exclusion of women in natural resource management, and so on. Now, an interesting point about this, it's much easier for academics to say this than NGOs. For NGOs to say this, you're biting the hand that feeds you, because the donor money is conditional on you working at the community level. Okay, so this is why we need to understand what it is that's going on. Why did that graph shoot up on the use of community-based? Why has community come on board as the default language for this? Is it partly because donors require us to work with communities? And I think that's the case. It's extremely difficult for NGOs to make this critique. Here's an example of land tenure. It's Bangladesh. I'm interested. Those of you who are metric, sorry, it's in acres. A hectare is about 2.5 acres. So in Bangladesh, this is people who own land. This is not the people who are landless. The people who own land, okay, the number of people on very, very small holdings is very small. Okay, plus the landless. If we were to look at a so-called community where an NGO might work, or the FAO or somebody might work, we see it like this. It's a mixture of houses. Each house is a household, but it is divided. In class terms, you've got the big owner at the top, the guy I shook hands with, and you've got the middle ones who've got some land, and then little bits of land, and then a huge number of people who've got no land at all. Okay, they haven't even got a little sign for it. They've got no land at all. In Bangladesh, between 40 and 60% of the rural population. Okay? How can they adapt to climate change? How can they be engaged in development is the problem we need to understand. And then we can divide it on gender grounds. So we've got class grounds there, and then on gender grounds, half of the village oppresses the other half of the village. And that isn't going to change with microcredit. So we've got a huge problem here, which is also embedded in the idea of in most parts of the world, of male preference. And you've probably all heard the arguments about the missing women, the missing girls in India and China, which we won't have time to go on. So I've been thinking about this, as you can probably tell, for quite a long time. And I wanted to do a little thought experiment, because in most of these countries, when you see people, the way they're dressed in a village, you go to Bangladesh or India, sometimes you can tell from the way people dress whether they're poor or rich, but it's not always easy. So I thought, where can we actually see this? Where is it more possible to have a visual idea of what is going on? So I thought about America in the South up to the 1960s. It's probably not that much better now, but in the South you would have a division on grounds of so-called race. And you would have people excluded, black people seated in the rear area, different toilets for the whites and the coloreds, as they called them, and poor whites saying we won't go to school with blacks. And you know there was that huge struggle. So here we have a community, these are small towns throughout the south of the United States, where you have racial oppression going on. It's visible. We know about it. There's a huge history written about it. And this is the school for whites, and this is the school for blacks in the same community. So what we've got to do is have the eyes that enable us to see this going on in the other countries in the world where we're working, where it isn't so eminently visible, and where I would argue NGOs are now actually ignoring trying to find it, because the donors do not want them to find it. They want to give them money to work with the communities, which is all nice and fluffy and cuddly, and the community is where it's going to be, and that's all right. So I'm going to stop there so we have time for discussion. The last two, don't forget, if you want the slides, maybe somebody could pass a sheet of paper around if you want the slides. I'll email them to you. But let me stop now so the people who have to leave at 2 have a chance to ask questions or make comments. Yeah.
I have a question about your examples about NGOs and how they use the term community and how it's in relation to donor pressure to work with communities.
Yeah.
I'm wondering if you have any examples that you have come across in your work of NGOs that are trying to advocate and trying to push for a more nuanced understanding with donors of what community might entail, or the problems of using that type of language. Just if you've come across any examples of that. Oh,
No.
Not at all.
No. There is complicity, widespread complicity in this. You know how dependent the NGOs are on donor funding. We've just seen the crisis with Oxfam and Save the Children. They are desperate to keep their funding streams open. And unfortunately, in my view, examining them, as I have done both within Bangladesh and globally, you will find people in the NGOs who are concerned about it. But in terms of the official presence, not enough pushback. But of course, I'm not privy to the private conversations that leading people in an organisation might have with DFID, for example, on their worries about the use of this terminology. I'm not privy to that, so I can't give you a definitive answer. But my experience, no. I gave this a version of this talk a couple of years ago, every year there is a conference which goes around the world. It's called the International Community-Based Adaptation Conference. And it usually has about 400 people. And I gave a version of this talk in a room with about 200 people, most of whom were NGO activists, either working for local NGOs in Bangladesh or international NGOs. And at the end, the chairperson took a vote. He said, how many of you are persuaded, how many of you agree with Terry that the use of the term community is not very helpful? And almost everyone put their hands up. And he said, how many of you agree with Terry that this, and about 4 people put their hands up. He didn't actually ask who was uncertain about it, but that to me represents the kind of the mainstream of a lack of concern about the use of this terminology. Yeah, there, and then there. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, from what I hear from you, one side of it is fairly evidence that there is a convenience and romanticization where external agencies find, community as a label to, on a blanket, speedily do things, saying it's organized, neat, and hunky-dory or participatory. But I think you're missing one point completely. I don't know whether that's intentional or that's not good. That there is fairly enough evidence in the pockets of the poorest elements that there is a support system which exists internally which makes people a community. It's not people in isolation. There are internal support systems which are very cultural or which are very geographic and which bring a certain homogeneity, which when everything else goes wrong, the survival actually happens in this mutuality. And the friction or the struggle I see is when external organizations go, we are in a hurry to label as community and do something. But on the other hand, if we had the time and energy to tap this internal homogeneity, there is a community. It's evidence. There are specifics which can bring that. And if any relationship for development strategies can happen around that, it actually kind of is one of the best, let's say, launching pads for self-sustaining in future, because they've been self-sustaining in past. It's not that you teach them self-sustaining. Actually, you teach yourself by being curious about how have they managed to survive.
Okay, got the point. Yeah. Okay. Well, my feeling about that is that you've slid the term community onto a group where it works, because it helps you to use the word community for us. In essence, you're talking about a subset of a village. Presumably, you're thinking of, is it India you're thinking of, where you've experienced this?
Yeah, specifically, yes.
Yeah, so this is a subset of what outsiders would call the community. Okay, they form their own community. We can call it that if you want. They probably wouldn't use that term themselves. And self-help groups, or the ability of poor and oppressed groups to find ways in which they can support each other, is common in many parts of the world. But they are oppressed. What is it that makes them poor? That's the question I'm asking, because the bigger community, they are a subset of what outsiders will call a community. Where are they within that? There is a cause of their poverty within that village, or within that bigger community. So that's what we have to be looking at. So the fact that some people can give each other mutual support, and you find this with women as well. Women in many parts of the world are able to give each other support in their oppressed status. In China, in ancient times, about 500 years ago, women developed their own language, their own writing script, so they could talk to each other in secret, and the men wouldn't know what they were talking about. So there are ways in which you can have, I would call these solidarities. These are forms of solidarity that you can create amongst people who suffer a similar problem. But I think that what is the key problem is, why are they poor and oppressed? What are the causes that are going on in that place? That's what I'm interested in, is why are they poor in the first place? Sorry, there and then there, I think, yeah.
I'm from Uzbekistan, and my research is also about community-based rehabilitation about disabled people. And my research question was also, one of the questions was, is there a community in its sense? And can it be adapted, this concept of community-based rehabilitation, which was developed internationally, can it be adapted to Uzbekistan's case? But we have this kind of an institution called Mahalla. I think it's also valid for India, or like so Mahalla is like the neighborhood of people living together, and it's kind of, there is sense of collectivity inside. But in Uzbekistan there is an official structure, for example, which is officially recognized. There is a legal law about the structure, and many people criticize it because they say that it's an extension of the government to control the citizens.
Yeah.
And they don't see any sense of collectivity and belonging to the structure.
Yeah.
But apart from the structure, I observe there is an informal sense of belonging, which is bound together by the religion. So Islam, it's called mosque community. So I think in some cases religion can be a thing that will be collectivizing or making this community work. And so, do you think religion plays a role in?
Yes, I do. I do think it plays a role. I think you find a rather different situation in Bangladesh compared with India, and that's because Islam has embedded within it notions of support, kindness, and charity towards people, and so I think you would find it less oppressive in that sense. But the paper I mentioned by Naomi Hussain actually did an analysis of what people in the elite in Bangladesh, what they thought were the causes of poverty of the poor people in Bangladesh. Only a tiny percentage of them said it was structural things about land tenure. The vast majority said it was about mismanagement, bad management by poor farmers, or not enough access to resources, and a lot of blah, blah, blah. There was not a sense of an understanding of the class nature of the oppression. And I think we can see in many Islamic countries that there is class oppression of poor people. So Islam does not, despite its charitable and the Ummah, despite that, it does not overcome class oppression. Yeah, I think there was a question up here. Yes, yeah.
My question was, when you were talking about the dates of the shift and things, and kind of also the reasons for this surge in the use of community, obviously it was like late 90s that it started coming. Do you think that is then for kind of for PR reasons from the big development agencies? You said that this term's kind of really friendly and it has this halo effect. Is it just for them then to appear that they care now and
Well, most big donors shifted over the last 30 years away from, for the spending they do in development and now in adaptation for climate change or disasters, they shifted from the idea of technical projects or top-down activities towards support for the argument of bottom-up, grassrootedness, which, IDS was part of the argument that should happen. And so they bought into that, but they've bought into it in a way which avoids what people at IDS and elsewhere were saying is what causes the poverty and the vulnerability there. So it is a badge of honour. It's the halo effect that if a big donor, like the World Bank, like in the book that they've analysed all those, it's a badge of honour. We're not doing it top-down, we're doing it with the people, participatory, grassroots. Yes, it's not exactly public relations. There's a theoretical justification for it, and so there is an argument underlying it. But the upshot of it is they do not want NGOs in Bangladesh to say why those people are poor and vulnerable. That's the last thing they want. You just carry on with your fluffy projects and make vulnerable people a bit better and not talk about why they're vulnerable or poor in the first place. We've just seen it literally in the last 2 years with DFID, because a lot of my field work is in what's called disaster risk reduction in the jargon. And in the last 30 years, those who work on it in academia and most of the important disaster agencies no longer talk about natural disasters. The notion that they are natural has been completely undermined by research and by practice. The disasters are not natural. The hazards are natural. Okay, you can't stop a hurricane or an earthquake, but the fact that people die in it is caused by social, political, cultural processes. The safest place to be in an earthquake is Tokyo. One of the least safe places to be is Dhaka or more as any city in Iran or Istanbul. And the fact that you're not safe in those places is socially determined. It's not a natural disaster. The fact that you die in a cyclone and so on is determined by social, political, cultural processes. And now DFID is talking again about natural disasters. Having stopped until about 2 years ago, it's now back. And that, in my view, is using language which deliberately avoids the need to talk about the social causation of risk. Sorry, there and then there, yeah.
Thank you very much for a provocative talk. I'm a PhD student now. I used to be a practitioner for a long time with the UN, so I had completely bought into that language. And I'm trying to think at alternative. By the way, I wasn't doing it for PR reasons. It was like, and you just touched upon this bottom up as opposed to top down. This is something I was really committed to.
Yeah, we all are.
What is the alternative though? So you say we use it instead of using people, location, places. How would people be a better language to use? It seems to me that the problem is that we're not questioning the cohesiveness of the community. So it's not just the term that is problematic, it's actually the approach.
Well, that's absolutely right. So why do we use the term community? Because it does have this halo effect. And I think that we've got to stop using the word community in places, which is the vast majority of the rural world, where the word community is covering up the explanation of poverty. And where it is used, in my view, the very use of the word community is in order to avoid looking at what is causing their poverty.
But just substituting people wouldn't necessarily change the problem then?
Well, no, because the word people does not have a moral... it doesn't convey the halo effect. It hasn't got a moral embeddedness in it. The word community conjures up an image. I think there's actually an element of it which is also a kind of nostalgic amongst Westerners, that can we support communities in places we've lost our communities in the West? Can we support the communities in India or Bangladesh or Kenya or whatever? But I haven't got time to go into that now. But the word people is pretty neutral. And the task is to understand what is the causes of people's exploitation and oppression. And by and large, that is gender, patriarchy, gender power, and class power, class power is generally in rural parts of the world is represented in land tenure, forms of land tenure. And those are the two things that mean that the word community, to my mind, is useless. Because the word community is used in order to conjure up the image of there being an entity which external agents can kind of massage. You massage this community, make it a little bit better than it was, and they always go along with it. There will always be somebody in the community who will say, "Oh, it's wonderful that you've come. We're going to collaborate with you on this," because some of them get something out of it. The elite capture. Generally speaking, you won't have any problem finding someone to go along with your idea of community-based disaster risk reduction or community-based this or that. I think there was one there and then Robert, yeah, and then over there. Yeah.
It's a fascinating discussion, actually. Fascinating. I mean, my background's anthropology. I work with an indigenous group in northeast India who call themselves a tribe. And I just wondered, the discussion after your talk we've had some different visions of internal dynamics within communities, and I just feel that the actual term itself seems to be capable of accommodating that complexity. It seems to be capable of accommodating the power dynamics that you're describing, the idea that communities aren't just these romanticised, perfect, unitary spaces. It seems to accommodate that quite effortlessly. I think everyone's going to leave the room with a reformed notion of community, but they're not going to necessarily maybe let go of that concept because it's adequate to the task. It just needs reformulation. I'm sure you've heard that before, but what's your response to that?
Well, I think that's quite interesting. And of course, if you want to carry on using it, but you're analysing the gender and class conflicts and ethnic conflicts, you know, in your area of India, there would be huge ethnic conflicts going on between different groups of people. If that's what you analyse, so basically what you would say is, before I'm going to do this project for maternal health care in this part of India, or climate adaptation in this part of Bangladesh, or whatever, the first thing you would find out, why are people poor? If you do that, I have no problem. Or why are women oppressed here? Okay, I have no problem. But that doesn't happen. People go in with a ready formulated idea that they're going to work with the community without the idea that they have to understand what is going on. That's my problem with it. The word community, with its halo effect or virtue signalling, makes it unnecessary to do that, because you assume that there is a ready-made group of people who are willing to collaborate with each other. And that's the problem. So I don't mind if we can find a way of doing what's necessary. The key thing is to find out what is causing their poverty. And if that is caused by processes going on within the so-called community, that's what we have to understand. That's what IDS was doing 40 years ago. Okay, and I think this is the problem now, is that there is a financial incentive on all development organizations not to rock the boat. Robert, I think it's your turn.
Thank you very much for that. Just to add in a comment and then a question. The comment is about other terms which are used with community. The World Bank, about 15 years ago, went big for community-driven, which is another one.
Yeah.
But what we formally work on here in IDS is community-led local sanitation.
Yeah.
And the history of CLTS fits with learning what you've been saying.
Yeah.
Because when CLTS started, it was the whole, quote, community all collectively making decisions that they were going to stop open defecation, and everybody would benefit. And some of the research generated in the early days sustained misperceptions about what was really going on.
Yep.
And where we've got to after, what is it, almost 50 years or so, where we've got to is a recognition that in the early stages, the communities, villages, or whatever, that were regarded as favourable were precisely the ones you picked out, which were homogeneous and relatively small.
Yeah.
But it meant that there was a sort of blind spot among CLTS practitioners about larger villages with conflicted groups within them.
Yeah.
And that's where we are now. And
Right.
it's questioned some of the fundamental ideas of CLTS.
Right.
Which is
Interesting.
what we're working on.
Right.
Which leads to its own sorts of conflicts.
Right.
The question I've got is about Mansouri and Rao, because it's a fantastic study that they did, and they were not only meticulous, but they were also very courageous within the World Bank because of the threat. Actually, the threat that they might have been sacked.
Yes. Yeah.
Working in the research department, but they stood by their guns. But my question is this: they produced all this wonderful evidence. How do you get people in positions of power within organizations to take on board those sorts of findings?
Yes.
It seems that we've got a blind spot, which is that we don't know how to get them to accept unpalatable findings.
Yes.
I mean, do you have any ideas?
I think it's a struggle. It's a constant, long. It's going to be a long struggle to do that. We're fighting that on so many fronts. And I don't have an answer to that, because they have an incentive not to listen to the evidence. We see this with the British government all the time. The British government does not listen to academic, well-researched and evidenced material to guide policy. We see this in so many areas. And I think that in political terms, that is because they have a constituency that they want to keep on side for voting. But in institutions like the World Bank, we need some analysis of what it is that goes on with institutional culture that prevents them learning from evidence. Now, we tried to do that. I forgot to mention this, but this book is free to download. If you search for it, obviously if you want the slides, I'll give you the reference, but this is the World Disasters Report, which I edited 2014 edition, Focus on Culture and Risk. And in this, there is a chapter on the myth of community, which we're now doing into an academic article, which is nearly finished, which we hope to submit to an academic journal and also something like Policy in Practice or IDS Bulletin, which will be for practitioners. But there's also a chapter in here on institutional culture and why do they not accept evidence. And the two bits of evidence that we're concerned about in here is that organizations that are working on disasters and climate change refuse to accept the evidence from all over the world that from participatory PRA methods that people are not interested in serious hazards. They're interested in the problems of everyday life. So if you go anywhere in the world and you ask people, what are the problems you face? They will not say earthquakes or cyclones. They will say water supply, malaria, crime, paying school fees. They never, ever, hardly ever say the serious hazards which these organizations are going to help them with. So why is it that these organizations ignore this evidence and just carry on plowing on? And the second thing that we're trying to get them to come on board with, extremely difficult, is given that the vast majority of the world's population do not have a scientific understanding of disasters or natural hazards. I talked on this in February. Some of you may have been there. Most people in the world have a cultural and religious explanation of why a disaster happens. In many cases, they are fatalistic or sent by God as punishment. And none of the major organizations that is trying to do disaster risk reduction accepts that they should be working on how people themselves believe about what causes disasters. So we're trying in this, we've got a chapter which is trying to look at institutional culture, which is similar to what you're saying, but it's a much narrower area. Why do institutions not act on the evidence? And it's a big struggle. They don't have an interest. Basically, our answer is they have a self-interest to ignore these things because they get the project money anyway. They just carry on doing what they want. They don't need to worry about the real reality. Yes, there and there. Yeah. I'll pass this round if you need to take a note of the title, but it is free to download.
Thank you, Sarah. That was really interesting. Just a few comments, but wanting to know your thoughts and comments. Thinking about the evolution of the use of the term community and how it's kind of become this hollowed out, this exercise of hollowing out and then kind of donors filling it with jargon and terminology to it becomes a mode of legitimization
Yes.
of their own ends.
Yes.
I wondered to what extent do you think the individualization of poverty has created that hollowing out of community,
Yeah.
around kind of putting more emphasis on the individual when actually there are communities that recognize the absence of the individual. And then secondly, I wonder if the evolution of development, I work with Rural Futures on kind of youth employment, and some of the evolution maybe pathways of their interventions has been this emphasis on supply side bias towards making sure that individual has X agency or has this income, has that, and that kind of individualization of welfare as well has kind of created this amalgamation of what we think community looks like. So I was wondering about kind of that aspect around the individualization of community. But secondly, to what extent is...
So can I respond to that first? I think we're in almost total agreement on that. And one of the early things I said is that this is to fit with particular ideologies. Is very much to do that. Yeah. The ideology of the donor system at the moment and DFID and so on is to treat poverty as an individualized phenomenon. It's not a social construct. So poverty is treated as something which is like an illness. You catch it. And we go around and help people to overcome this illness with poverty reduction and so on. So there's no explanation of what's causing it. And you don't need it. To give aid nowadays, you can do the aid programs of all the major donors without actually needing to explain why people are poor. It's deliberate. It's deliberate to do that, to avoid it, because it fits with the ideology. So you can come back on that if you want, but you had a second point.
Yeah, my second point was looking at how you're tracing the emergence of the use of community. The value of the word community seems to have changed in its own right, and it's become a self-fulfilling prophecy. I saw a really interesting video on the BBC of a Maasai village of women. I don't know if anyone else has seen this, but these women have been told by interventions and that like patriarchy is bad. They need their own agency, and so they have chosen to leave their original.
Yeah, I think I saw it. Yeah, very interesting. Yeah.
To what extent has community then become, like, I would say what you were saying, that's more of an identity of solidarity as opposed to community, but they themselves choose the vernacular community. So what extent does that idea of the emergence of community become a self-fulfilling prophecy based on other ideas of power and relationships to the structure and what they themselves define as community of a sense of place?
It's a very good example. I think Mansouri and Rao would say that is an organic community. That is an organic expression of people's own desire to self-organize in a different way. Whether or not they use the word community in English is whether what they would use in their own language would be interesting. But I think it's a very good example of organic or spontaneous. It's not been fostered from outside. So I think that's a very interesting example, and I think it does tie up with the notion of solidarity, because people have ways of building solidarity. When they're oppressed, exploited, they find ways of finding solidarities which do not just do not challenge the power structure enough that they get slapped down. And that's a common thing you find around the world, is that people will find ways in which they can help their own mutual survival through solidarity without the landlord coming and killing them.
I just think from what you've been saying, solidarities is a better use of trying to look at how we critique community.
Yeah. There and then there, yes.
Okay, thank you very much, Terry, for the eye-opening discussion. But I just wanted to make a follow-up to Robert Chambers' question earlier on, and maybe just to say that I believe most of us here are agents of we are agents of change, and how do we then move after this in terms of taking the word to our institutions? Because I come from government, and because I learned something while I'm here, I would want to go back and make change within my institution. Do you have or does IDEAS have a plan, like maybe the way the SLF, the Sustainable Livelihoods approach, was handled and being cascaded into institutions that drive development? So how do we then approach this community thing within institutions in terms of making change within the institutions?
I think you have to find your own way. Yeah.
Okay. And then the other thing is the definition itself. Is there a definition that you prescribe to say that this relates to the way you define community, or it's also up to us to decide? I mean, in terms, if you want to relate it to what you've just been saying, that it's neutral and it doesn't really go into the causation of poverty.
Yeah. No, I wouldn't want to prescribe what the term community should be. What I'm doing is critiquing how it's used.
Okay.
So I'm critiquing concretely how it is used by organizations at the moment. So, and I hope I've provided arguments and some evidence as to why I think that's a problem. It's a problem for me because it detracts from achieving what we're supposed to be doing, which is supporting poor and vulnerable people, But here, the problem is always the outsider insider. You know, most of what we call development activities are done by outsiders to the insiders. So what gives us that right? What is it that? Why is your government not developing its own people? Why, famously, 3 years ago, Amartya Sen wrote an article which said, "Why does India not have a universal healthcare system?" Because the country is 3.5 times richer than it was 20 years ago. Where has all that money gone? Why wasn't it taxed in order to create a healthcare system? So the underlying what I'm saying is a much bigger argument about what is development, where development is defined as outside agencies which claim to be improving people's lives. And my worry is if these outside agencies are claiming that they're helping people's lives without having an explanation as to why they're poor and vulnerable, then it's extremely doubtful whether it's useful. Now, what you do in your organization or your government is for you to decide, using the best tools and knowledge and understanding that you've got. But you can more or less guarantee that in most governments in the world, they will not want to examine what is the real cause of a problem. Another one of my favorite fake concepts is food security, as you've probably heard me talk about before. So food security is now used when we used to talk about hunger. So nobody used the term food security 30 years ago. It was hunger. And if you talk about hunger, you have to explain why are people hungry? Whereas food security, the danger is you say, oh, we've got to produce more food. And the problem becomes a technical problem. It's no longer a political or economic problem of food distribution and wealth distribution. So these concepts which slide into our practice, and if you wanted to do a project, and IDS or whoever wanted to do a project on what we used to call hunger, now it would be framed around the concept of food security, and you'd have to use that language in your research proposal or your bid. And so all around us is the sliding, and the other word is, which we haven't got time to go into, is resilience. The sliding into fake concepts which enable the powerful to avoid us examining what is causing the real problems. There was one behind you first, Robert, if that's all right. Yeah? Yeah. Sorry, it's me, the problem of having to chair it myself and hoping I see all the hands going up. Yes, carry on.
I did my PhD work in Vietnam looking at land use change in coastal areas with the introduction of aquaculture.
Yeah.
So there was a lot of...
In the Mekong or?
In the north.
In the north, right.
Yeah. And so when aquaculture arrived, there was groups of people who were able to take advantage of it, and they were able to consolidate, they gained more and more land, they were successful. There was another group of people who were able to get employment working for them, and there was a group of people who suffered badly and they were increasingly marginalised. But they interacted with each other a lot because they had a shared concern and they shared resources. So you could say there was solidarity or a community or a group or whatever.
Yeah.
So that within the community, you had this. It was fractionalised into these groups. And then you had NGO projects that were trying to revive mangrove areas, and it was a community-based mangrove project. So I asked them, how was it community? And they said, oh, well, we work with the local women's groups, we work with the local mass organisation. So when I was in the community, I asked about these organisations, and then the people said they're all corrupt. Basically, it's mafia, it's syndicates. People grab hold of resources, they distribute it around themselves. So for an NGO to work in that community, first of all, they've got to work with the established power structures, or they just don't get into that community at all.
Yeah.
And then another thing is they have to, in Vietnam, they have to show to the Vietnamese government that whatever they do is going to support any policies that they have. So it's another hurdle that they have to go through. And then also the donors. Aquaculture in Vietnam, a lot of the markets are in the West, in America, Europe, China also. So a lot of the reasons for the marginalisation at the local level is local power structures, but also the trade, the global structure of the trade, the WTO, and so if you change the term, would anything actually change? Because the donors are still not going to address the real problem, which is the kind of trade structures of
Mm.
aquaculture goods, and then at the local level, I don't, where do you direct attention
Yeah.
to change the
Well,
donors, the
Well,
NGOs?
it seems that you've described very well, I mean, a fascinating case study and parallels in other countries as well, where the mafia controls the aquaculture and so on. They wouldn't call it the mafia, but
Yes.
the big guys, whatever, yeah. We see it in Bangladesh and so on. So it seems to me that you've described very well what you need to analyse in order to see what's going on. And the word community is not very useful in that. But some of the actors, for reasons which benefit them, might use the term community because it helps grease the wheels that bring them money. Yeah, so they're quite happy to use the word when it has no scientific meaning. So to me, a concept, words in social science, words represent concepts for analysis. So we basically use concepts with which we construct a wall, which enables us to have a building, which is the analysis of what we want to do. And the words, the concepts become meaningless when they do not actually understand why that brick does not connect to that brick, and that brick is going to fall down because the concept you're using does not explain the relationship between the different elements of the analysis. And it kind of perpetuates the problem, as you found. And I think you described it very well with a very interesting case study. I'd love to see your thesis.
And it was also as well that the people at the local level were marginalised. You know, America or the West still subsidise their industries and then dump whenever they produce a surplus. So
Yeah.
that's still going on, so they're marginalised through the local processes, and also there's this global one, and then
Right.
the money comes from the global. So it's a
Yeah.
it's a
Yeah. So do please send me your thesis. Robert and then there, and I suspect that's probably the last two that we'll be able to have time for. Is that all right? Any other burning comments or questions before we have to finish at 1:30? No. So Robert and then there. Yeah.
Well, I wonder if we need a new term. Because when you were talking, you used the word community at least 3 times. I don't blame you, because for the purposes of what you were saying, it made sense to use the phrase. And I was thinking back to livelihood and how livelihood got into the mainstream and
Yeah.
became sustainable livelihoods. And it was a very, very big struggle in the mid-90s around the social developments summit in Copenhagen over whether they would use the word employment or livelihood.
Yeah.
Because livelihood's much more inclusive.
Yeah.
And employment is a northern industrial term.
Yeah.
You see. And it was a hell of a struggle, particularly with people who were deeply embedded in an economist's mindset. You know, I mean about numbers, because you can't. You can generate numbers about lines. And then, anyway, the point is that I think you have to have a term, an alternative term. And I don't know what it is, and maybe there can't be one because we keep on saying community.
Yeah.
But I wonder if it's worth brainstorming and seeing if there's an alternative term which can then be inserted. And livelihood and sustainable livelihood, they were adopted by IIED.
Yeah.
And IIED made a big thing of this in the
Yeah.
mid-90s. And then it gradually got adopted by other organisations,
Yeah.
Oxfam, DFID, and then it was all over the place.
Yeah.
But it took 10 to 15
Yeah,
years.
absolutely. Yeah.
So
I agree.
It's a
Let's-
long campaign that you have.
Yeah,
But
yeah,
you need a
absolutely.
term first.
Yeah, we've got to think about that. Yeah. Thank you. And then yourself. Yeah.
My name's Kathy. Thank you for a very nice talk.
Yeah.
My concern is, what are you going to do about this? Because, community, the word community has been manipulated in various ways, and so have a lot of other words, so that the language changes, and quite often it's a manipulation by those in power, so that they can justify their own ends. And a lot of aid these days is actually vested interest for doing what they want.
Yep.
So a lot of the money that DFID gives is actually about ploughing back into their own industries, their own academia, their own NGOs and so on. So, but there have been projects, small projects in many countries, I think, run by small NGOs, small missions, where the motivation of those people is to go and run a clinic or a hospital or some project, and they come under increasing threat because they can't get funds. So I just wonder, is there some kind of evaluations that we can do in academia, some kind of language we can develop to hold these big organisations like DFID to more account? I mean, you know, what can we do about it? It's all very well saying, well, you know, community is a rubbish word now. I mean, the word gay meant something different 150 years ago. Now it means something, and so language changes. So what can we do about it?
Well, me giving this talk is one part of it. Writing the book is another part.
Yes.
We're carrying on writing. And as Robert says, this I'm not expecting it to change by next year. I'm expecting this to be a long, hard campaign against organisations that have a self-interest in carrying on using the word community, as they do resilience and food security. And so to the extent that I can have an influence, I will just do the best I can. I'm delighted to do it here at IDS because this is a place where people will be able to carry that on. I think, as Robert said, this is going to be a long, hard struggle. The people that use the term have a self-interest to keep it.
I wonder if you could say, just have VPs, vulnerable people. I'm not sure what answers it. But you can say VPs very, very simply and substitute that for community.
Well, let's have a longer discussion on that, which would be good. Dion, we're just about to finish. Do you want to make a point? Yep.
Yes, I just wanted to, because of the research that I've been doing, I think a way to start tackling this would be to look at all the organisations who have got frameworks and guidance and training, because
I think you need to speak up a bit, if you can, yeah.
So people like the World Resources Institute, who have training, guidance that anyone, NGOs, can use, it seems to my mind very simplistic and doesn't give enough detail. If you built into the frameworks and the teaching this discussion, knowledge at the beginning and have sort of precepts before they undergo this training, I think that would start to help.
Thank you. I'm going to call an end to it there, if I may, and thank you all for your excellent questions and comments. And don't forget to send me an email if you want the slides. Very happy to share them. And download the book and download the Mansouri and Rao book. They've also got shorter papers. If you want something shorter than their book, Google them and you'll find they've got some academic papers as well.